My brother has an accountant, and my boss has a tax attorney. I just started a small real estate company, and I'm wondering, which one will I need?
You're listening to Practical Tax with tax attorney Steve Moskowitz.
There was a time when most people thought that all was needed for the taxes was an accountant. And that's how I started my career out. I was a CPA before I was a tax attorney. But then things changed, and the IRS got more aggressive, and they started summonsing in accountants and say, what'd your client tell you, and hand over the papers, and what'd you tell him? And with an attorney, we have attorney-client privilege, and also there is a difference. That's why when I became a tax attorney, I was already a CPA, but I wanted to be able to do more for the client, like be able to go into tax court for him or her and everything else. So to me, having achieved both licenses, there's a big difference between a tax attorney and accountant. For me, my personal experience was I had a certain range of service as a CPA. When I became a tax attorney, that's so broadened. There was so much more I could do for a client. And that's the reason I went to law school, to become a tax attorney and be able to do so much more for my client completely. And over 20 years ago, I met my colleague, Liz Prehn, a tax attorney. And Liz, what are your thoughts on this area?
I think it's really an interesting question, and I see the value in both the CPA and the tax attorney. I think for our clients, it provides an interesting tension that provides a great result for our clients. The CPAs had one set of rules, generally very conservative. The tax attorneys had maybe a little more persuasive and maybe pushing some boundaries or coming up with some ideas that perhaps the CPA doesn't take into account. And it really provides a great result for our clients. As for the attorney-client privilege, I think we all know, tax preparation is tax preparation. But in a lot of our criminal cases, we certainly have a extension to a CPA to help us interpret the case, and that can only be done through an attorney, through the code.
So what happens is that sometimes we'll bring in people. Suppose, for example, someone speaks another language, and then the translator isn't an attorney. So what happens is a provision where anybody the attorney hires to work under him or her has that privilege. So when I'm speaking to that client in the other language and the client's telling me all his secrets, the IRS can't go to the interpreter and say, aha, Mr. Interpreter, you're not an attorney. What did the client say? No, he's under the privilege, the umbrella. And that's one of the ways you get around that. So that's why, for example, if an accountant is going to be employed, the client doesn't employ the accountant. The attorney employs the accountant. So you have the attorney-client privilege.
And interesting that the change, how cannabis has evolved. Back in the day, the CPAs and the accountants used to have a real problem with their clients because they didn't want to know certain things or certain business activities, but they had to be able to comply with their taxes. At least a lot of people did. A lot of people didn't, just bypass the whole tax system, but a lot of people were in the business of it and wanted to be able to buy houses and things like that. And so what they would do is they would have their accountant, and then they would have their attorney, and they would go to their attorney and get advice and how to handle the tax situations, because that part was privileged when they're talking to their attorney, not when they're talking to the accountant. So that's been interesting to change now that cannabis is a little more legal, not federally, but
I like that. A little, that's a perfect phrasing. A little more legal. And there's a great controversy between so many of the states and the federal government. Obviously, we'd like to see the federal government move so it's simple and it's completely legal. And that would also go ahead and take care of a lot of other problems. For example, there's a code section I don't like. It's Internal Revenue Code Section 280E. And if you happen, and this is so unfair, this would apply to a cocaine dealer or a cannabis dealer where he or she is only entitled to deduct their cost of goods sold, not the operating expenses. So if you have this situation, for example, for me as a former CPA, I know what those are, but basically cost of goods sold is, like the name says, the expenses that are incurred making the product, unlike an operating expense for rent. So almost any business person can deduct the rent for their business, but a cannabis owner can't. So what someone will do is say, well, wait a minute, they're in multiple businesses. They're in the T-shirt business, and they're in the cannabis business.
Well, we saw that with the Champ case, right? And it is unfair. It's kind of counterintuitive to have a business that's legal in the state, but they're essentially getting taxed on, double taxed because they don't get their business expenses.
So what happens is, what people are trying to do is say, well, all right, they're in multiple businesses. They sell cannabis and they sell T-shirts. So the portion of the store that is related to T-shirt selling is deductible. And then we have, of course, the argument of, well, wait a minute, how do you make the allocation? There's all kinds of things that come up. For example, you have somebody saying, well, the T-shirt is $50 and the cannabis is free. And the government says, well, wait a minute, you are misstating. And there's another code section where if a person with multiple businesses misstates something or allocates improperly, the IRS can come back and reallocate. And Liz, maybe you can tell us some more about the Champs case.
Well, we're seeing a lot of tax audits. The Champs case was kind of the first case that really came on the radar because the taxpayer won, in a sense, and they were able to show the allocation. Since then, the number of audits of dispensaries and other cannabis-related businesses have really skyrocketed, and that's kind of it's been limited now. I think the most recent one was the Harborside case. We covered quite extensively on our blog, actually, which was interesting read.
I made good reading. Of course, I always love reading about taxes. A lot of times, sometimes I'll say things and people are thinking I'm making a joke. For example, when people get married, I always say, well, marriage is a great tax event, and they laugh, but it really is. We're not writing for other tax attorneys and professors in most cases. We're trying to basically make you aware of something. Like if we were surgeons, we wouldn't tell you how to do the operation, but we would tell you this operation is available and it could alleviate the pain in a certain area of your body. So in tax, there's so much that's available. And from practicing these 30 plus years, so often when I tell a client, well, you can do this and this, they look at me in wonderment and say, well, is that new? And it's not. It's been around for a long time. Or they just can't believe that they can do these things. So the more you become aware, the more you can save taxes. We'll help you along in that area. But you really want to have some awareness of this because there's so many golden opportunities to save taxes. And of course, we're real excited about, the new tax law and the 199A and cost segregation analysis and pensions. But there's a lot of other things too that can be individualized and really save people a lot of money. The reason that I became a tax attorney was obviously I wanted to do more than when I was a practicing CPA, and I did. But there's a real difference, and you can benefit from that. And here we have the knowledge of both, and it really makes a difference. Whether we're talking about talking to you, planning, doing your tax return, or in tax court when the judge asks a question that an attorney wouldn't understand, and the accountant can pop up and say, yes, so we understand the forms as well as the theory.
The bottom line is having a tax attorney offers you attorney-client privilege, which is a huge benefit and often very needed. And in this day and age, what you're telling people can really be held against you.
You've been listening to Practical Tax with tax attorney Steve Moskowitz. To hear more podcasts, go to moskowitzllp.com.
The information contained in this podcast is based on information available as of the date of its release. Moskowitz LLP and the value of a tax attorney is under no obligation to update this information as changes occur. Applying this information to your specific situation requires careful consideration of all factors which may be applicable, and any information is not to be considered tax advice or legal advice. Further, this is attorney advertising, and the factual and legal circumstances described are dependent on the facts of that particular case. Individual case results will differ based on different facts, law, and other factors. Please consult your tax advisor before acting on any matters discussed.